This episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries is supported by Shopify. Starting a business usually begins with one simple idea and a lot of excitement. But then, very quickly, it turns into a mountain of what-ifs. What if I cannot build a professional website? What if I do not know the first thing about marketing? What if I just cannot do it all myself? This is exactly why Shopify exists. They have built the platform so you do not have to be an expert in everything to be a success. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world, helping turn big ideas into real-life brands. If you're worried about design, Shopify's ready-to-go templates make it easy to build a beautiful online store. If you need a hand, their AI tools can help write product descriptions, enhance images, and even generate discounts. And if people haven't heard about your brand yet, Shopify make it simple to run email and social campaigns to reach new customers. Plus, their award-winning 24/7 support is always there if you get stuck. So stop asking what if and start asking why not. Turn your dreams into and give them the best shot at success with Shopify. Sign up for your €1 per month trial at shopify.ie. That's shopify.ie and see what you can build with Shopify by your side.
Go Loud presents Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Brought to you by Revive Active. Steady energy that works in synergy with your body. Shop the full range at reviveactive.com or in pharmacies or health food stores nationwide.
Ireland Crimes and Mysteries is presented by Go Loud, Ireland's leading audio publisher and the home of Irish podcasts. Find new episodes on the podcast first on the Go Loud app and on your favourite podcast platform. Welcome back to another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries with me, your host, Newells. Before we get into this week's case, I just wanted to give a big shout out to my wonderful sponsor, Revive Active. I'm so delighted to have partnered up with them, as what sets this Irish brand apart is the science behind it. Their powdered supplements are formulated using bioavailable ingredients, meaning your body actually absorbs the ingredients. For me, the biggest benefit has been the lack of an afternoon slump. It provides that steady energy throughout the day while also supporting your immune system and your heart. It's a premium product that genuinely makes a difference to how you feel. Available online at reviveactive.com or in pharmacies and health food stores across Ireland. Now, let's get into today's story. Now, before we get started today, I just want to flag that this episode deals with some very heavy content. Specifically, the murder of a woman in her own home, domestic violence and coercive control, and a child who witnessed violence against her mother. If any of that is too much for you right now, please take care of yourself for starters and come back maybe when you're feeling in a better headspace, or just wait for the next episode. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, you can contact Women's Aid on their 24-hour free phone helpline on 1800 314 900. All calls are free and confidential. Now, having said all that, today's case takes us to Arklow in County Wicklow, a port town on the east coast about an hour south of Dublin, sitting at the mouth of the Avoca River. On the 14th of December 2019, in the early hours of a Saturday morning, a 30-year-old woman named Nadine Lott was beaten and stabbed in her own apartment there. She never regained consciousness, and she died 3 days later in St. Vincent's Hospital in Dublin, surrounded by her family. The man later convicted of her murder had been in that apartment while Nadine was out with her family celebrating her aunt's birthday. Her 6-year-old daughter was asleep inside. That is where this case begins. Now, before I get into what happened on that night, I want to read you part of the victim impact statement that was delivered by Nadine's mother, Claire, at the sentencing hearing, because no description I could put together of who Nadine was would come close to what Claire said about her own daughter in that courtroom. She said, "Nadine was a textbook baby. She was a bubbly child. She loved to run around and make people laugh. She was a loving child. I would say to her, 'What would I do without you?' Her response was, 'Be lost, Mummy.' This phrase was said often, even up to our last day together. And here I am now, lost." In 2019, Nadine was 30 years old and she was living in an apartment in Arklow with her daughter, Kaya, who was 6 at the time. She worked as a beautician and had built up a solid client case of her own over the years. She'd been a single mother since Kaya was born, supporting herself and Kaya independently, and by the end of 2019 had even been approached about some modelling work. Her life had come together in a way it hadn't always been. Earlier in 2019, herself and Claire had been to Rome together to celebrate Nadine's 30th birthday, and Nadine had said to her mother while they were there, "I'm actually so happy. I don't need anything else." And you can't say it much clearer than that. She was very close to her family, her mother Claire, her siblings Phoebe and Tanith, her father David. They were a tight-knit unit, and Nadine was very much at the heart of it. When her grandmother was unwell in the last months of her life leading up to February 2019, Nadine was there every day reading to her, singing songs, climbing onto the bed for a cuddle. Nobody asked her to do any of that. That was just who she was. She did it without being asked, because that was her nature, as Claire put in her statement. She was a popular girl. She was the caring one. A wide circle of friends, a social and vibrant nature, a great sense of humour. She was devoted to Kaya and to her family in equal measure, and by all accounts she was a wonderful mother. She worked hard and got on with things without complaint. And for years, she'd been trying to untangle herself from a man named Daniel Murtagh. In 2012, Nadine went to Australia on a working holiday visa. She was 23 at the time and ended up in Darwin in the Northern Territory, where she got work as a beautician in a salon there. It was in Darwin that she met Daniel Murtagh, who was also over from Ireland on a working visa from Clondalkin in Dublin. He was fitting windows. Nadine described him to her family as funny and a great laugh, and Claire would later describe their early relationship as a type of holiday romance. In 2013, Nadine found out she was pregnant, and she made the decision to come home to Ireland to have the baby close to her family. Of course, that was very much in keeping with who she was. Daniel followed a few months after her. He had shown little interest during the pregnancy, and when Kaya arrived, he was not there for the birth. It was Phoebe, Nadine's sister, who was there. Phoebe took that honour, not him. And from the very beginning, it was clear, looking back on it now, that Daniel Murtagh was far more interested in the idea of Nadine than in the reality of what having a child together and building a life would actually require of him. He was fond of the single life, as the family would put it. He liked his drink, his drugs. He was number one in his own priorities. And Nadine and Kaya were an afterthought to him at best. He was from Clondalkin, as I said, in Dublin, and by the family's account was not what they would call a very savoury character. But Nadine tried regardless. For the first 3 years of Kaya's life, she made excuses for him when he didn't show up, invited him along to family events, and put genuine effort into trying to build something stable. She had grown up in a close and loving family herself, and she wanted that for her own daughter. She would invite him to birthday parties, family dinners, any occasion she could think of that would give him the opportunity to be present for Kaya if he chose to take it. If he didn't show, she had an excuse ready for Kaya before he even failed to appear, because she'd learned well enough by then that he probably would. She was not doing any of it because she was in love with him. She was doing it for Kaya. By 2016, the two of them had spent years going back and forth, on and off, and getting nowhere fast. At that point, Nadine organised a viewing on an apartment that the three of them could potentially move into together. It was her last genuine attempt to see if there was anything worth building there. A real and concrete step towards making a family life for her daughter. Daniel did not show up. He disappeared for 3 days without contact or explanation. That was enough for Nadine. She ended the relationship for good after that and began building her life on her own terms without him in it. She told people she was not upset about it and she did not care about him in that way anymore. But she was willing to stay civil and keep some line of communication open for Kaya's sake. What Nadine did not fully appreciate at that point was how far Daniel Murtagh was from accepting any of that. After 2016, Nadine and Daniel were not together. That was clear to everyone around them, and it was settled as far as Nadine was concerned. But over the next 3 years, it became very clear that Daniel Murtagh had never truly accepted it and had no intention of doing so. Looking back on those years, the family recognise it now as a pattern of coercive control. Of course, that was not the language they were using at the time. He retained some contact with Kaya, but his interest in his daughter was inconsistent and unreliable, to say the least. He would promise to visit and simply not turn up. The family said that when it came to child support, he insisted on handing over the money to Nadine in person on each occasion, rather than just transferring it, and that this was his way of keeping control over the arrangement. Before long, the family had come to believe that Kaya was really just his means of keeping access to Nadine, that she was his reason for coming back, rather than any genuine desire to be present for his own daughter. He monitored Nadine's movements and was very territorial about the idea of her seeing other men, despite having no claim whatsoever over her and not having had one for years. When Nadine went on a date with a Turkish man, she received a text from Daniel the very next day that read, "So you were out on a date? I think I'll go and get my hair cut at a Turkish barber's," letting her know that he knew, that he was watching. And this was a regular thing, the family said. Whenever Nadine had any kind of social life that didn't include him, he found a way to let her know he was aware of it. Nadine adapted to it, the way people do when they have been dealing with something for a long time. She started keeping things from him, not so much from fear as from exhaustion. She said it to her friends and her family. "It's easier. I don't have to put up with the grief." She never said a critical word about him in front of Kaya. If he promised to come and he didn't show, she had an excuse ready for her daughter. She absorbed it all herself, so that her little girl didn't have to carry any of it. And who would blame her? The family believed he had not been physically violent with Nadine before the night killed her. Nadine was open with the people around her, and they believe she would have told them if he had been. But looking back on it, the family described a man who thought he could pick up and leave off whenever it suited him, and that Nadine would always be there when he decided to come back. That she was still, as far as he was concerned, his, even though they had not been a couple for years. There's also the matter of his boxing. He had been training seriously for years, and to a semi-professional level by his own account when he was speaking to the Gardaí. The prosecution would later point to the condition of his hands and his boxing background as part of their case on intent. Despite what he had done to Nadine that night, there was very little damage to his own hands. On the 5th of December 2019, 9 days before Nadine died, she sent Daniel Murtagh a WhatsApp message that was later shown in full to the jury at trial. It read, "Nothing is ever going to happen between us again. I want to make that clear." She had said versions of this to him before, but she was saying it again now in writing, in plain language, with no room at all for any other reading of it. And in that same exchange, the court was shown messages where Murtagh asked her was she seeing someone from Dublin, and whether there was a Dublin lad in her place. His response to her telling him it was over was to monitor her movements. Then, in the days that followed, he issued a threat about another man potentially being at her apartment. Her reply to that was 4 words, "Don't threaten me either." The family were not fully aware of how bad things had gotten in those final 2 weeks. Nadine kept it from them, as she had always kept these things from the people she loved most, so that they wouldn't have to carry the weight of it and be worrying about her. The 13th of December started out as a good and happy day. Kaya had her ballet recital and the whole family were there to see her. After that, the family were all heading out for Nadine's aunt's birthday, drinks in town, a Friday night before Christmas. Other than that, the evening was entirely unremarkable. Daniel arrived at the apartment that evening. He had not been invited. The family said, and the prosecution made the same argument at trial, that he'd essentially presented himself there, and Nadine, not wanting a confrontation before she went out with her family, let him stay with Kaya and headed out for the night. While Nadine was out celebrating with the people she loved, Daniel was in her apartment drinking. He had rum with him. He had cannabis. He later told Gardaí in evidence read to the court that he had taken 2 pills he described as Valiums at around 10 o'clock in the evening. He was drinking and smoking in the apartment while Kaya was asleep in the next room. As the night wore on, he was sending messages to Nadine, asking where she was and when she was coming home. And at 1:26 in the morning, he began calling her, He called her multiple times, but she didn't answer. The family believed, and the prosecution argued the same, that he was not there out of any concern for Kaya. He was there because Nadine was going out and he wanted to be in her space when she came back. And when she walked in and told him to leave, everything that followed came from that. Nadine came home in the early hours of the 14th. What we know about what happened when she walked back into that apartment comes from the forensic evidence, from the witness testimony heard at trial, and from Murtagh's own account to Gardaí across 4 separate interviews. And those admissions got progressively worse as the truth worked its way out of him. He was still awake when she came in. The two of them argued. Nadine told him to leave. He'd been drinking and smoking in her apartment all night while her daughter was asleep next door, and she wanted him gone. As he later told Gardaí, his state of mind at that point was that he was, in his own words, a little bit hurt because she had not answered his calls and he had convinced himself that she was out with another man. He told Gardaí he was not triggered at all, just a little bit hurt, and that nothing would have happened that night if he had been sober and had been let sleep it off on the couch rather than being asked to leave. And then he attacked her. The assault was prolonged. We know this because Nadine's neighbour across the hall was woken from her sleep by the noise. She initially thought it was people coming home from a Christmas night out and turned over in her bed. But then she heard screaming and banging specifically from Nadine's apartment. She got up, went to the door and found it standing open and stepped inside. Daniel was crouched over Nadine on the floor, pounding her face with his fists. The neighbour told the court he was making frustrated growling noises. She described him as vicious with rage, like a wild animal. Her words. She told the jury she could see him using his full body weight to press down on Nadine's neck and shoulders while Nadine was gasping for breath beneath him. She called out to him. He looked straight through her, as if she was not standing right beside him at all. She ran from the apartment. She rang Phoebe first because they had gone to school together, and then she rang the guards. The neighbour's partner also gave evidence at trial. He had seen Daniel getting into his car and driving away from the scene. He then went to Nadine's apartment himself and walked as far as the hallway. He did not go any further. He called her name and stood there and could hear her gasping for air. He could only see her shoulder from where he was standing, and he called for help as well. Kaya was in that apartment when all of this was happening. She was awake. She saw what he was doing to her mother and she begged him to stop. She cried and screamed at him to leave her mummy alone. And then, with a presence of mind you would simply not expect from a 6-year-old child, she hid his phone and his wallet because she understood that if he ran, there would need to be proof that he had been there. She was 6 years old and she thought to do this. Her actions formed part of the evidence that helped put him behind bars. Phoebe and Claire got to the apartment before the ambulance arrived. Claire had left her house so quickly she had no shoes on her feet. The first guard on the scene that morning, Garda Linda Butler, had 14 years of service. She described an intense smell of blood the moment she stepped through the door. Nadine was on the kitchen floor with her head pushed up against the skirting board and her mother kneeling beside her. There was a large pool of blood around her and a butter knife in the blood. Broken glass everywhere. Nadine's face was severely swollen. She was unresponsive and labouring to breathe. When Garda Butler rang for an ambulance, she told the dispatcher that Nadine had been beaten to a pulp. Blood, she said, was coming from everywhere. She told the court it was the worst scene she had encountered in all of her 14 years of service. That she had never in any of those years seen a person beaten so badly. When Garda Butler cleared Nadine's airway, she found that several teeth had been knocked out. Another Garda Silverlock, also gave evidence about what he found when he arrived. He told the court he could hear Nadine struggling to breathe, and he said he could barely make out her face because it was covered in blood. The paramedics who arrived described the apartment as looking like a bulldozer had gone through it. Broken furniture everywhere, shattered mirrors and frames, glass on every surface. They were kneeling on broken glass themselves while they tried to keep poor Nadine alive. Nadine suffered multiple cardiac arrests in that apartment. They lost her pulse at least 3 times before they got her out of there. At one point, there were 4 paramedics working alongside members of an armed response unit, all in that apartment at the same time. They had to move her from the kitchen to the living room just to give themselves enough room to work around her. One of the paramedics said it was horrendous and the worst he had ever walked into, that it was extremely and unbelievably difficult, very emotional and very charged. And eventually one of the Gardaí drove the ambulance to St. Vincent's Hospital in Dublin so that all 3 paramedics could stay in the back with Nadine and continue working on her the whole way there. Claire got down on the kitchen floor beside her daughter and told her, "You're okay, we can do this." She gave her CPR until the ambulance arrived. She told the court afterwards she didn't think anything she was doing was really helping. Claire could not recognise her own daughter. Nadine was still alive when she reached St. Vincent's. The court heard that in the first 24 hours after Nadine arrived in St. Vincent's, she received 42 pints of blood. To put that in any kind of context, that is the entire blood volume of the human body replaced several times over. And it tells you everything you need to know about the extent of her internal bleeding. The nurse who treated her in the emergency department found pieces of wood and ceramic and what appeared to be fragments of a dinner plate matted into Nadine's hair. She described Nadine as tiny, and she said her head looked enormous in comparison to her small body because of the swelling. There was not one part of her body without injuries. Her nose was bleeding continuously. That nurse broke down on the witness stand at trial when she was describing to the jury how she had tried to make Nadine look as presentable as possible before the family arrived later that morning. She said, "It didn't make a massive difference what I did because they had already seen her at the scene." Claire had brought photographs of Nadine to the hospital and placed them beside her bed so that the staff would know who she was and what she looked like. When the staff in the ward first saw the photograph and asked who the woman in the photograph was, the nurse replied, "That's Nadine." Nadine died on the 17th of December 2019, surrounded by her family, 3 days after the attack. She'd been alive and well and out celebrating with that same family 3 days before. She was 30 years old. The post-mortem was carried out by Chief State Pathologist Dr. Linda Mulligan. She identified 64 individual injuries on Nadine's body, including blunt force trauma from hands, fists or feet, stab wounds and injuries from a blunt weapon. The cause of death was recorded as hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, which is what happens when the brain is deprived of oxygen following traumatic injury. Her brain had swollen as a result of the sustained violence done to her. When her neighbour ran from the apartment to get help, Daniel Murtagh left. He got into his car and drove south out of Arklow. He didn't get far. He crashed into a ditch near Lara in County Wicklow, not far from the Vale of Avoca, in the early hours before dawn. He was found staggering away from the wreck by a man named Mr. Begley, who was driving that road with his wife that morning and came upon the crash. He had no shoes on, his trousers and underwear were around his knees. There was blood on his hands and his head. He asked Mr. Begley was he a guard and told him he wasn't very good at interrogating, and then he told him he had killed his wife. When Mr. Begley mentioned the guards were down at the crashed car, Daniel became very agitated and said, "You don't know what I've done." He told Mr. Begley he had killed his wife because she had been with his friend. He said he hoped she wasn't dead. He said he was sorry to her family. Mr. Begley's wife rang for an ambulance. It would be an hour before it arrived, and in that time, Daniel was alternating between agitation and distress, at one point saying he loved his girlfriend, that they had been together for years, but they'd had a row. The paramedic who attended the scene got much the same. Daniel told him he had PTSD and had taken 2 Valiums and had been drinking. And he told the paramedic that he had killed his girlfriend. The paramedic told his colleague, who in turn told the Gardaí. He was arrested at Tallaght Hospital later that morning. Nadine was still alive at this point. He was charged with serious assault at Bray District Court on the 16th of December while she was still in ICU. When Nadine died the following day, the 17th, the charge was upgraded to murder. He was remanded in custody and formally charged at Clover Hill on the 14th of January 2020. He gave 4 separate Garda interviews in the days that followed, all of them conducted before Nadine died. Gardaí read the statements from those interviews into evidence at the trial. In the first interview, he played everything down as much as he possibly could. As the interviews progressed, the details got worse. By the 4th interview, the full picture had come out as reported in court. He admitted to punching like mad, to giving Nadine 6 or 7 hard digs, to going, in his own words, too far with his hand. And throughout all 4 of those interviews, he referred to Nadine as his future wife. At one point, he said to the guards, "Now you're telling me my future wife is barely going to wake up." He told them she would not be getting up to watch Love Island that day. Her friends get battered by their fellas nearly every week, he said. He also told them he knew Nadine was with a lad in Arklow and he was trying to get it out of her. Gardaí had found a tyre pump charger and a cable on the sofa in the living room, both of them covered in blood. Evidence heard at trial that in the interview he told investigators he had held the charger in his closed fist and wrapped the cable around it for what he called solidity. It made his fist harder when he was punching. As he was doing this, the loose cable kept getting in his way, so he stood on it. He snapped it and kept going. He then demonstrated this in the interview room by leaning forward in his chair and punching downwards through the air towards the floor, confirming in the process that Nadine was already on the ground when he was doing it. He said the assault only happened in the living room and that he had left Nadine there still breathing. The forensic evidence presented at trial told a very different story. Her blood was found on the kitchen walls, on the cabinets, across the surfaces of that room, and Daniel's own fingerprint was found in her blood in the kitchen. And the court heard there were drag marks, a trail of blood from the living room to where Claire found Nadine in the kitchen. He denied the stabbing entirely, but she had a cut from her ear running down along her jawline and a stab wound into her neck. He told Gardaí 50 times over that he had only used his fists. He said he was only a little bit hurt. He told them he would love for them to get inside his head and have, in his own words, a little wonder at why he had done what he did. He also maintained across all 4 of those interviews that he and Nadine had been in the process of getting back together and that they had been seeing each other in secret in the weeks leading up to the attack. Superintendent Declan McCarthy, who led the investigation, formally refuted this. There was no evidence of any reconciled relationship. The text messages from both phones made that clear. Nadine had been keeping things civil for Kaya's sake. That was the full extent of it. One of the senior investigating Gardaí made a statement after the verdict that I have not forgotten. He said, "In 40 years of policing, I have never seen or heard of such a level of violence used towards an individual. From the very start," he said, "there was never any doubt in our minds about the intent. The intent was to kill Nadine. And that was it." The trial opened at the Central Criminal Court on the 20th of July 2021 before a jury of 7 men and 5 women. Daniel Murtagh pleaded not guilty to murder and guilty to manslaughter. His defence was intoxication. He had consumed, he said, approximately 350 ml of rum, had taken 2 pills he believed were benzodiazepines, and had smoked cannabis on the night of the attack. The argument put to the jury was that this combination had left him incapable of forming the specific intent to kill or cause serious harm that is required for a murder conviction, and the charge should therefore be reduced to manslaughter. Now, this is a recognised legal defence in Ireland. Under Irish law, voluntary intoxication can be raised as a partial defence to a crime of specific intent, including murder. If a jury accepts that the intoxication genuinely prevented the accused from forming that intent at the time, a murder conviction carries a mandatory life sentence. Manslaughter gives the judge discretion in sentencing, and that is precisely what the defence were trying to achieve. The prosecution, led by John O'Kelly, pointed to the nature of the attack itself as the answer to any question about intent. The tyre pump charger cable wrapped around his fist for added force. A sustained assault that continued while the neighbour stood in the doorway calling his name, and he did not even register that she was there. A knife fused. Nadine dragged from one room to another. A car driven out of Arklow afterwards with enough coherence to reach County Wicklow. And perhaps more tellingly of all, the state of his hands. The prosecution put it to the jury that this was not what you see when someone loses control. It was, they argued, what you see when someone knows exactly what they are doing. There were many witnesses who took the stand over the course of the trial, including Nadine's daughter Kaya, her mother Claire, her sister Phoebe, her brother, and the neighbour, Gardaí and hospital staff who had treated Nadine. The neighbour gave her account of what she had witnessed that morning. The paramedic who attended described it as the worst he had ever walked into. One that would stay with him, he said, for the rest of his career. The nurse who had tried to make Nadine presentable before the family arrived broke down on the stand. And then there was Claire Lott, who had been on that kitchen floor in the early hours of the morning giving her daughter CPR and been completely unable to recognise her own child. The defence barrister cross-examined Claire. He put it to her that Nadine and Daniel had gotten back together 5 or 6 times since they had both returned from Australia. Claire said that this was not true. He then asked whether it would be fair to say she didn't like Daniel. Claire's response was, "I never said that. You are asking me that question where my daughter has been murdered. Before this, at times I did like Daniel. He was Nadine's choice at the time. And then he wasn't." The jury were directed by Mr. Justice McGrath to act clinically, dispassionately, and without sympathy towards the deceased, her family, or the accused, in keeping with the presumption of innocence. He told them to focus on Daniel Murtagh's intent at the time of the killing. If they concluded he intended to kill Nadine, that was murder. If they concluded he intended only to cause her serious harm, that was also murder under Irish law. Because murder is a crime of specific intent, and causing serious harm falls within that. The intoxication defence was available to them, but only if they genuinely believed it had prevented him from forming any such intent. The jury deliberated for 5 hours and 46 minutes across 2 days. Just after noon on the 5th of August 2021, they returned to the courtroom. Daniel Murtagh was sitting in the dock in a grey suit and a pink shirt. He looked straight ahead as the verdict was read. Guilty of murder. Unanimous. Not one dissenting voice among the 12 of them. He waved to his family in the public gallery before he was led away. On the 4th of October 2021, Mr. Justice Michael McGrath sentenced Daniel Murtagh to the mandatory life term. There is no discretion in sentencing for murder in Ireland. It also came out at the hearing that day that Daniel had 9 previous convictions, one of which from 2011 was for threatening and abusive behaviour. The victim impact statements were heard in open court. Claire Lott told the court the family were haunted by Nadine's terror, her fear, her panic and her cries on the night of the attack. She described it in her statement as the prolonged evil attack. She said the family now sees traumatic counselling replace hobbies, night terrors and sleepless nights replace sleep, and life replaced with an existence. Claire also spoke about what the trial process itself had been like for them as a family. She said from the minute the trial began to the moment it ended, it was all about him. Nadine's identity had been reduced to evidence. She was not heard in that courtroom, Claire said, until the victim impact statements were read. And that is why it mattered so much to stand up as a family and say clearly, she was not a wife, she was not a girlfriend. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister, a granddaughter, a niece. Daniel Murtagh filed legal papers at the Court of Appeal in 2022, seeking to squash the murder conviction. He withdrew the appeal in April 2024. The conviction still stands. Kaya is growing up and is doing well. They talk about Nadine every day in that family to keep her alive for Kaya and in their own lives. She knows who her mother was, She is very much aware that she is the only child in her school without her mummy, and nobody can make that right for her. But it is not a road she has to walk alone. She has a family around her who are not going to let that happen. The Nadine Lott Trust was established in her memory, both to provide financial security for Kaya throughout her life and to raise awareness about violent crimes against women in Ireland. Claire has spoken about what that kind of grief does to your sense of time. It almost feels, she said, like you are continuously living in 2019. It still doesn't feel like it was that long ago since we last saw her. Her own life has continued in exactly the same way as it always did. Same house, same work, and Kaya was always going to be there anyway, so nothing around her has visibly changed. And so she just keeps expecting Nadine to walk in the door. The murder of Nadine Lott was cited alongside other cases in the years that followed as part of a wider public conversation that put pressure on the Irish government around domestic and gender-based violence. Between 1996 and 2025, approximately 275 women were killed violently in this country. More than 60% of them were killed in their own homes, and 1 in every 2 was killed by a current or former intimate partner. Nadine is in those numbers, and that is what those numbers are made of. Real women, real families, real children growing up without their mothers. The third national strategy on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, running from 2022 to 2026, brought new offences into Irish law, including for stalking and for non-fatal strangulation. A dedicated statutory agency for DSGBV became operational in early 2024. The Lott family was part of the advocacy that pushed all of that forward, doing that work while still in the middle of their grief, which takes a particular kind of strength and I think deserves to be said. Claire Lott herself has become one of the most prominent voices in Ireland calling for mandatory domestic homicide reviews, a process that would require a multi-agency examination of every domestic killing to ask what was missed and where the intervention could have happened. She has also been very vocal about the need for better education about the early warning signs of coercive control, so that families can recognise what is happening before it escalates the way it escalated for Nadine. It has not been introduced in Ireland yet. There is also an ongoing push to change how character references work in these cases, how the family law system handles survivors of domestic abuse, and how a victim's identity is treated inside a courtroom. Claire described Nadine as being reduced to evidence across the course of the trial, and she's not the only family member of a victim who has said exactly that. It is something that those pushing for reform in this area keep coming back to, and rightly so. I'll close with Claire's question, the one she used to ask Nadine, and the one between them that always had the same answer. What would I do without you? And Nadine always said the same thing back. Be lost, mummy. And here she is. Right guys, that's it for another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you again to our new sponsor Revive Active. Investigating these mysteries takes a lot of mental energy, and I've really noticed how that one morning sachet helps me stay balanced throughout the day. It's not a quick fix or a caffeine spike. It's just about sustainable, steady energy that fits into a busy life. If you want to start your own daily ritual, head over to reviveactive.com or pop into any good health food store or pharmacy nationwide. It's a simple way to look after yourself now and as you age. Until next time, I'm Nools. Take care.
Go Loud presents Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Brought to you by Revive Active. Steady energy that works in synergy with your body. Shop the full range at reviveactive.com or in pharmacies or health food stores nationwide.